And so ultimately what I'm advocating for is for parents and students and teachers and districts and superintendents and governors to be as creative as possible, to think about the range of possibilities and to stop thinking about them in terms of this old crumbling structure that just didn't work before. Hello, all those beautiful faces. How we doing? Stephanie checking in with another episode of Class Disruption, disrupting the status quo of education. And before we get into it, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, plus that notification bell so you can get notified every time I drop a video. And of course, share this video. That's the most important thing you could do, is spread this teacher power all around the globe, because we got to take our education back and disrupt this status quo. But let's get into this video today, because I know the major question on everybody's mind as we're approaching this 2020-2021 school year is, are we going back for in-person instruction? And if we are, to what extent, and what is that gonna look like, and this and that, and there's just so many questions, and rightfully so. I mean, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and in the recent weeks there has been different school districts coming out, a couple in California, the two biggest actually, and different small ones coming out and saying they are not going back for in-person instruction this fall. So that includes Los Angeles, San Diego, and I know a couple other smaller ones from some of my Instagram followers. They told me as much. Whereas other districts, like New York City, are considering more of a hybrid system. And actually just the other day, New York State released their guidelines, their reimagination of school in this reality. And so we're gonna check that out. But before we get into all that, I just want to establish two things that guide my thinking throughout this. And the first one is,
people are dying less.
yes, as Brett Weinstein said, the death rate is coming down. And we're going to be hearing from Brett and his wife, Heather, throughout this episode. I watch a lot of their content. I think that they are amazing. I don't agree with them on absolutely everything, but I love the way that they think and the things that they're doing and the types of conversations that they're having. And I'm going to be featuring them throughout this video. I highly suggest that you go check out their stuff. I put a link in the description down below, but just know you're going to be seeing a lot of Brett and Heather Weinstein throughout this episode. So as I was saying, and this is a very, very good thing, the death rate is coming down. And while the media loves to show you headlines about, oh, there's a spike in California, there's a spike in Florida, so many new cases, the US is #1 for all these cases. Mind you, there's lots of things that would be driving that, like the fact that we're immensely bigger than all these other countries, but that's to the other side. They're less often going to tell you things that are good news, like the fact that yes, there are all these new cases. Yes, there are places that are experiencing spikes, but guess what? Overall, the death rate is coming down. And I'm just going to show you this chart right here that confirms such. So from the New Scientist, why are U.S. coronavirus deaths going down as COVID-19 cases soar? Again, not a headline that you're going to see on the mainstream media, at least as often as you're going to see those more fear-mongering headlines. And so here it shows a chart, how the cases are indeed, we went, this is that spike that we saw mid-April going into May. Then we were kind of steady going down. And now as things are opening back up, we've seen this rise in cases. Also, I know that there is not an exact match between the rise in testing to the rise in cases, but our testing capabilities have gotten better. That being said, I think that they could still be immensely improved. And then here you can see that boom, here's again that big spike that we had in April, and this is of the deaths. And then it went down, and you can see, even though the cases have gone up here, our death rate has continued to pretty much go down. And just the other day, we were down to 391 altogether. And it goes through some explanations for this. First and foremost, better treatments. That's something we have to bring into the conversation for sure. But there's also other reasons. For example, there could be a lag. It could take a longer amount of time now for people who are dying from this than before. Also, there could be more new cases because younger people who are less likely to die from this are getting it. So several different reasons here. But one of the most important things that I think really doesn't get enough attention is that we are getting better at treating this thing. The therapeutic treatments have gotten better. And I'm going to play this clip from Heather and Brett that kind of go through this and explain why this is happening.
You have a brand new virus. It is spreading like wildfire, and doctors are seeing it in large numbers, right? Those doctors are fielding it best they can based on the next nearest phenomenon that they know. And a lot of it turns out to have been counterproductive or ineffective, and they learned, right? They may not even fully understand what they've learned. Some hospitals may have learned better than others, but doctors in contact over the internet will have exchanged information, and they are getting better at dealing with COVID patients.
And we highlighted early on in late March and early to mid-April, for instance, a few doctors saying, "I'm not sure ventilators is the right way to go. This doesn't look like that kind of disease. Why have we formulated it that way?" And this to your point that it could well be that in fact care for people with this disease is simply getting more effective.
Care for this will get more effective. It will continue to get more effective.
And of course, none of this is to undercut the seriousness of this disease. I mean, here in New York City, it was the epicenter of the outbreak. It was not a day that went by that we didn't get a report of one of our students and their families being affected by this, whether somebody was getting sick, somebody was dying, somebody lost their job. So I've seen firsthand, or at least secondhand, I don't know if that's first or second, how this disease can, especially in a densely populated area, work its way through and just devastate a community. And so we definitely need to remain vigilant, especially because there are so many reports of people getting this thing and recovering, but still having weird symptoms or not feeling fully as they were pre-COVID. So these are all things to keep in mind, which brings me to my second point.
There's nuance here.
We have to recognize that the United States is a huge country, not only in terms of population, but just so geographically diverse. And one place that's out in the rural middle of nowhere is going to be different from being in a city, from being in a suburb. And not only that, but there seems to be differences in age where younger kids are much less affected and even much less likely to spread it than as people get older. So these are all things that we need to take into consideration when we're thinking about what does going back to school look like. And I just want to make sure that we don't get locked in to these positions which have become politicized, where it's just very these dualities, right? Of mask, no mask, of go back to school, don't go back to school. It's got to be nuance. Of course, in an ideal world, we would have had this thing handled and we would 100% without any doubts be able to go back to that in-person instruction. And now we can have that argument of how did the US handle it compared to other countries. If you want to leave comments down below, what do you think? See me on Twitter. This isn't really going to be that space where any of those ideas are for fodder, because that's just simply not the reality. We want to talk about what do we do given this reality. Then on the other side of that spectrum is everybody stays home and we do 100% virtual instruction. And now I will get to this virtual instructions piece in a second. But really the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about everybody staying at home is single parents, working parents, people who can't afford to stay home with their child all day or afford other daycare or babysitting options. And now, of course, I don't think that schools or teachers should be daycares or babysitters. That's not what we're there to do. But at the same time, I don't want to deny the reality of how our society is set up. So in this way, I think the outcries of I'm not going to be a martyr for capitalism that I see all over Twitter and to a lesser extent on Instagram have much merit, especially because you're tweeting them from your iPhone, sitting at home in the air conditioner on your couch, still collecting a paycheck, sipping on your latte from Starbucks. So tell me again what you don't like about capitalism. And now we're going to come back to this idea because I do think that there is actually a way to solve this. And I do think that there is a valid point here, right? What is the role of the family in the child's life in this time period where we have this compulsion to go to K-12 education? And we're going to come back to that. But I said I wanted to get to that virtual instruction piece because virtual instruction has been more or less a failure. Now, of course, you can point to shining examples. I might point to myself trying to make the best of it. But overall, it was trying to do what a system was doing before that wasn't working, which in a large part has to do with the way that we conceive of education in the first place, and which was unfortunately almost too perfectly demonstrated by the situation in Michigan that took place a couple weeks ago. I have this ProPublica article. Let's check it out. Tell us about it. A teenager didn't do her online schoolwork, so a judge sent her to juvenile detention. That seems like the appropriate answer. So, a 15-year-old girl was incarcerated during the coronavirus pandemic after a judge rules that not completing her schoolwork violated her probation. It just doesn't make sense, says the girl mother. And no, it really doesn't. On the one hand, I can understand why we might want to tie, schoolwork or completing school to a probation requirement. But on the other hand, is this really what the outcome of that should be? Like, just for not doing your homework, you're going to get sent back to jail? Or should we kind of look at the bigger picture? But let's find out a little bit more about this situation. One afternoon, mid-June, Charisse drove up upon the checkpoint at Children's Village Juvenile Detention Center in suburban Detroit, desperate to be near her daughter. It had been a month since she last seen her when a judge found the girl had violated probation and sent her to a facility during the pandemic. The girl, Grace, hadn't broken the law again. The 15-year-old wasn't in trouble for fighting with her mother or stealing, the issues that had gotten her placed on probation in the first place. She was incarcerated in May for violating her probation by not completing her online coursework when her school in Beverly Hills switched to remote learning. I'm going to play a clip from Heather now, going through the situation and really just reinforcing why and how virtual online learning just peels back and shows why our system is broken.
15-year-old girl in Michigan who has, among other things, an IEP, an individualized education plan, and a history of mood disorders, and sort of a difficult relationship with her mother, who is the only parent in the household, but a loving one, didn't do her homework when school transitioned to online in March. She didn't do her homework. Wow. And she was sent to juvenile detention as a result. Not doing her homework was a violation of her probation, the judge declared. So Keiko points out in a thread about this, and there's a story in ProPublica. ProPublica?
Let's go Publica.
Okay, so ProPublica has a story which we'll link to in the description or the pinned comment on this. But Keiko points out that the judge wrote in her decision that Grace, the 15-year-old in question, quote, is a threat to community, as original charge was assault and theft. That assault and theft being a skirmish with her mother in which both parties have since apologized. So she was deemed a threat to the community for not doing her homework. How is this justice, Keiko asks, which, of course, it's not justice. And more to the point, though, this so points to the failure of virtual schooling and a misunderstanding of what school is. It imagines this virtual classroom garbage, imagines that school was about sitting in classrooms doing rote tasks and memorization. That's not education. That's not education, people.
She really hits it. Like, this just is not what learning is. Right now, for New York City summer school, it's 100% virtual online. We're using this iLearn system, which is kind of like the equivalent of Google Classroom. And then the content doesn't come from me posting. It comes from this place called Edmentum. And I'll link it in the iCard right up here, somewhere up here. Check out that video, me recapping the first week and just what a mess it's been. I'm gonna do another video after this week, talking about where we were, where we've come since then. But it's just, it takes away your job as a teacher. I posted about it on IG earlier, and this is what I wrote in the caption. You can see me and my son, we're sitting down, we're doing some work, and I say, it's so nice to have a real actual student and do some real actual teaching. Since my job as a teacher has been boiled down to phone call maker, right? Be wary of prepackaged online curriculum mandated by large bureaucracies looking for data to tout. NYC schools, the data you get from these systems means absolutely nothing in terms of actual learning and mastery. Do better. It's just another version of fill out this parade of worksheets and then pass this test. It lacks any real meaning or application. And that's just so much of what our school has become. Oh, do this so you could pass a test. And then she follows up this story by reading a segment from the book called The Weapons of Mass Instruction. And I know the purpose of this video is to answer that question of how should we go back to school? What should that look like? But I really think that this segment is important for getting to the heart of what the problem is or problems are with our system, and thus are amplified by virtual learning. And it really is what class disruption is all about, and helps point us in the direction of some solutions for what school might look like in the middle of this pandemic.
A big secret of bulk process schooling is that it doesn't teach the way children learn. A bigger secret is that it isn't supposed to teach self-direction at all. Stanley style is verboten. School is about learning to wait your turn, however long it takes to come, if ever. And how to submit with a show of enthusiasm to the judgment of strangers, even if they are wrong, even if your enthusiasm is phony. School is the first impression we get of organized society and its relentless need to rank everyone on a scale of winners and losers. Like most first impressions, the real things school teaches about your place in the social order last a lifetime for most of us. Work in classrooms isn't important work. It fails to speak to real needs pressing on the young. It doesn't answer burning questions which day-to-day experience forces upon young minds. Problems encountered outside school walls are treated as peripheral, when in truth they are always central. The net effect of making work abstract, subject-centered, external to individual longings and fears and experiences and questions, is to render students of this enforced irrelevance listless and indifferent. The causes for sluggishness in the young have been well understood for a long time, I'm tempted to say forever. Growth and self-mastery are reserved for those who vigorously self-direct, like Stanley, planning, doing, creating, reflecting, freely associating, taking chances, punching the lights out on your tormentors. But this is precisely the agenda school is set up to prevent. Think of school as a conditioning laboratory, drilling naturally unique, one-of-a-kind individuals to respond as a mass, to accept continual ennui, envy, and limited competence as only natural parts of the human condition. The official economy we have constructed demands constantly renewed supplies of leveled, spiritless, passive, anxious, friendless, familyless people who can be scrapped and replaced endlessly, and who will perform at maximum efficiency until their own time comes to be scrap. People who think the difference between Coke and Pepsi, or round hamburgers versus square ones, are subjects worthy of argument.
Reminds me of George Carlin saying that the purpose of school was to make you just smart enough to operate the machines.
And so ultimately what I'm advocating for is for parents and students and teachers and districts and superintendents and governors to be as creative as possible, to think about the range of possibilities and to stop thinking about them in terms of this old crumbling structure that just didn't work before. Why are we thinking in terms of 30 kids in a class moving between 8 different classes throughout the day to a bell schedule? Why not assign every teacher 30 kids, and every 2 or 3 days they take turns coming in for live instruction, or the teacher can see them 2 hours throughout the day, and the teacher's just responsible for teaching those 30 kids across the curriculum, designing a project that implements all those different aspects. And then this also gives the teacher more flexibility. They can do their class in different locations. They could take them outside. They could take them to the park. They could take them on a walk to go see the area where something historical happened, or where some famous person lived. There are just so many possibilities. And that's why I really like the thinking of one of my Twitter followers. She's a New York City teacher. And what I love is that most of the time we think radically different. I mean, she posted up a tweet earlier talking about like defund the suburbs. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But at the same time, what I really love about interacting with so many people, especially ones who think differently, is how often we think the same way too. And it's about coming together and unifying around those. And she put out an article in the New York Post about teaching outside. So I just want to quickly bring some attention to that.
Teachers Plea for Outdoor Learning by Leah Olnick, Darcy Whitmore, and Heather Constanza. So the one who I follow is Liat. And they make a lot of good points. Similarly, we know remote learning is no substitute for in-person relationships. Right, and then they talk about the drawbacks, about being crowded, underfunded, all the different health hazards, of course. But what if there's another way forward? And I just love it, thinking creatively, thinking positively, thinking like, how can we do this? What if this crisis was actually an opportunity to ensure public school students access to rich, joyful experiences in nature, the same way their mostly white, wealthy, or private school counterparts already do, while also providing a childcare option to families? What if our youngest students were able to look back on this year not as fear, confinement, but one of exploration, healing, and freedom? Like, yes, 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 this is how we have to be thinking. And she makes so many great points about, too, how it's like an issue of equity, because the rich kids, the kids who can afford it, whose parents could send them to private schools, who could get them the tutors, who could keep them at home, they're going to be doing these things. They already are doing these things. And we need to stop picturing education as being in a classroom and taking notes and analyzing tests. It needs to be an experience. Let's go walking through the woods. Let's have discussions around a campfire. The way that we've come to implement learning in a systematic form is just not what learning should be. And I highly encourage you to go check out the rest of that article. I'll put the link in the description down below. And now I want to circle back to schools being the way that our society is set up, and how oftentimes we as teachers get plugged to be the babysitters, right? Well, the parents don't have anything else to do. The parents got to get back to work, capitalism. And it is related to that answer I just said. We have to be thinking differently. So even more radically than schools thinking differently, I want parents to start thinking differently about what their role is in their child's education. What if instead of sending your kid to school, you create a co-op with a few families around your neighborhood and you hire one teacher? They could do the socially distant thing. You wouldn't have to worry about all the jumps and hoops and checkbox. You could choose your teacher and make sure that teacher is actually dedicated and actually knows what they're doing, and your child just doesn't end up in a class because that's the teacher the school has, but they're not that great of a teacher. I think that this is a wake-up call for everybody. Of course, yes, the schools as institutions themselves, but also the families to, again, really reevaluate what is that relationship between us as the family, our child's education, and the institution of public education. That being said, I want to take a look at the New York State guidelines Governor Cuomo put together with his reimagining of public education in New York State, right? I'll admit, at first I was quite suspect of the whole thing, reimagining. There was somebody, I think from the Microsoft was, we're going to help New York State reimagine the way they do education. So I was skeptical that there was going to be some centralized top-down system that they put into place, but that does not seem to be the case. It seems like they've left a lot of the autonomy in the localities, in the local districts, and for the different schools based on the situation they have. And then they put together some, what I think are common sense and reasonable guidelines, minimum guidelines for everybody to follow. So let's take a look at that, starting with kind of like the overall press release and those minimum threshold numbers for these things to even apply. Governor Cuomo announces new data-driven guidance for reopening schools. Data-driven. Data. Yes, let's see that data. So it says school regions in phase 4 can reopen if daily infection rate remains below 5% using 14-day average. So as a minimum, as a threshold for these things to apply, you have to have a infection rate below 5%. and of course being at phase 4. Schools will close if regional infection rates rises over 9% after August 1st. So this is interesting. There is a little bit of a discrepancy, right? They can remain open if it's below 5%, but it says it will close if it's over 9%. So what happens between that 5% and that 9%? Not sure. But we're going to go through their guidelines in a second. But I just did want to point out that here in New York, we've been around a 1% infection rate recently. Even in New York City, you can look down here where they break it down by region. You could see 1.2%. This is a little higher, 1.7%, 1%, 0.8%. So New York City, 1%, right around there. And then you can see even in the cases for New York City here. So you can see even in New York City, there was 219,000 people who got tested, and only 250 of those people came up positive. So this is all good news. We're looking good here, New York. Maybe it's possible we got through the worst of it. Nobody else really spiked like us, so they're experiencing that now, and then hopefully they will come down and be able to stay in this 1% range like us. I mean, I'm just being optimistic. Of course, things could get worse, and we need to stay vigilant. But they're going to go through these different things in here. So let's click through to the actual guidelines themselves, written out in their very proper and extensive form. We've got 23 pages. Some of it does get quite repetitive, but there's some stuff we're going to go through because I think it helps guide us through a lot of the questions that I've been seeing being posed by teachers. So, the first section does definitions, and then it goes down into like different requirements that the plan of each district is going to have to include. And then they talk about some of their minimum standards and some of their guiding principles, which I think are also interesting. So definitely I would encourage you to go through, whether it's New York State or it's your own state, go through and look and see what the state put out. It's definitely good to know. I'm going to go through some of the definitions that I think are important, are going to help us answer a lot of the questions that we might have and how it might look if we go back to school. And like I said, I think more or less these are reasonable standards for us to get back. Okay, so we're going to go through the core health and safety principles and definitions. I think that this is a good section. Like I said, the whole document is kind of repetitive, and it just takes these concepts and puts them out. Okay, this is what your plan has to have. This is what our minimum guidance are. But let's go through the definition. So face covering, responsible parties must maintain, responsible parties meaning like the people at your school, the district officials, the people who are in charge, must maintain protocols and procedures for students, faculty, staff, and other individuals to ensure appropriate PPE is used to protect against the transmission of the virus when on school grounds, right? And so this means like an acceptable face covering, which is strongly recommended to be worn by all individuals at all times, but is only required to be worn at any time or place that individuals cannot maintain appropriate social distancing. So what they're basically saying is that we want you to have masks. If you're in a space where you can't socially distance, you have to wear them. But beyond that, it's going to be more at the discretion. Now, there is a place where it says that like individual schools can require them at all times if they want to, but they also have to provide like times and spaces where kids can go to relieve themselves of the mask. Here it talks about like social distancing, how they're defining social distancing, and basically they say it's 6 feet apart in all directions. So I had heard talk of the CDC was lowering it to 3 feet, and I actually have heard of other schools in other countries only having 3 feet, and maybe even the United States as well, but in New York State we're defining it as 6 feet. And it talks about using proper barriers, but they can't affect airflow. We got to be thinking about the spaces that we're using. And this is the part where I really start to, again, get excited about, okay, how are we teaching? Because space is so impactful in how you organize your instruction and the things that you can do. Let's open it up. Let's think beyond the classroom. What other spaces can we use, including the outdoors? They do say that they believe that we should prioritize a return for all students to in-person instruction. And again, this is something that I've been saying. Virtual instruction is not a replacement. We need to think about how can we get the most kids back to in-person instruction for as much time as possible. But, and here's where that nuance comes in, don't stick me in one category or the other. We need to make sure that we are doing it safe. We are doing it to prioritize health just as much as we are prioritizing people getting back to work and being able to provide for their families. Another idea, again, I talked about this, how a teacher could kind of be put with one group of 30 kids and like those could be their 30 kids. So putting kids in cohorts so they're not mixing around with all different students each period with a different group of kids. We're going to have much more static groups. Now, it still says that teachers can be going in between cohorts if that's needed, as long as they're maintaining social distancing. Saying another thing that they're going to be requiring is screenings. And so this is going to be temperature checks for everybody who's entering the building every single day. And if you have a temperature greater than 100, you have to go home. And it talks about different areas. So I know a lot of teachers have questions about these things. Okay, if somebody does have a temperature, what's going to happen? Or who's going to take care of them? Are they going to be isolated? What if the parent can't come get them? So it really does address all those different things, saying that you need to have a dedicated area where people can be held until they can go home or get picked up. And then in addition to the temperature checks, there's going to be a questionnaire. It seems like they're saying that for faculty and teachers, it's going to be something that you have to fill out every single day, just like online, confirming that you don't have any symptoms. Again, this is something that I've seen done. I read an article, about a child or a school in China that every single day, like you had to take your temperature and log the temperature in and just, say if you've had any other symptoms. And then again, when you get to school, they also give you a temperature check. So it does seem like New York has been taking into account different places around the country or the country around the world that already are getting back to it and using what they've seen working for them. However, students aren't required to do this every day, though it says that they could use questionnaires periodically for students. So I don't know why they would say like teachers always have to do it and students don't. I guess maybe because kids are less likely to have it, or I guess just logistically it would be harder to get all the kids to do it and enforce it versus teachers, there's less of them and they're more likely to be compliant. Though I do have issues with my attendance, so my secretary is going to be coming after me for attendance and for filling out my questionnaire. So it just goes through transportation. They're making considerations for food services, ventilation, contact tracing. And I think that they do a really good job hitting on and accounting for all of those different questions that I've seen, rightfully so, teachers put out about how is this going to work. And I just hope that when teachers do get answers, they can be able to look at it with this nuanced view, and not just putting ourselves in these tight and rigid camps.
So in terms of the guidelines put out and the way that New York State is approaching this with their 5% infection rate threshold, and then the very comprehensive set of guidelines that they've been putting out, really answering and providing some guidance for all of those questions that teachers have been asking, that makes me hopeful on the one hand. But on the other hand, going through summer school right now and seeing the way that this big centralized bureaucracy moves very slowly and clunkily, that gives me cause for concern, right? How well will this plan be implemented across all 1,800 schools in New York City? Because even if my school does it well, which I really have faith about my individual school, given the performance that we had from the transition to in-person to online learning, to the planning that we are doing a month or a month and a half before the end of school, to just the way that my school functions normally. Like, we are a standout school in New York City, I'm gonna brag a little bit about it. So I have faith in my school, but because we are within this whole system, what happens in other schools inevitably is going to affect us. And if they don't implement it to the level that we do, that could undercut our own efforts. And then secondly, we need to be thinking creatively. We need to be totally taking ourselves out of that old paradigm of moving through 8 different classes with all these kids, with all these different teachers, and trying to check off boxes and do a bunch of worksheets so that you could take a test, and get back to what learning really is before we institutionalized it. And class disruption, y'all. That's just where we're going to end it right there. Class disruption. That's what this moment needs to be about, is rethinking all the parties who are involved, the parents, the students, the teachers, we could get rid of everybody else as far as I'm concerned. But no. Smash that like button if you enjoyed this. Let me know in those comments down below what you're thinking. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What are you worried about? What are you optimistic about? Let me know everything down there. If you haven't yet, subscribe, hit that bell so you can get notified every time I drop a video. And of course, share this video. That's the most important thing you could do. Share this video with your teacher friends. Share this video with students. Share this video with parents. Let's spread the word. Let's get this conversation going. And I know it's crazy times. There's a lot of stress going on, but stay foolish, y'all.